Hello and welcome to the Church of Christ Bible Rewind for the Santee Church of Christ that meets in Santee, where we just review what we did in the last class, the things that we studied and talked about. So if you missed the class, you can just watch this. It's a reduced review of the things that we said and the things that were discussed, so you can catch up if you have any questions or that sort of thing. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, and in this specific class, we covered the last part of chapter 11, and we got into chapter 12. Now, if you want to know about the book, or you want an introduction into it, and to want to find out, what, how it's built and that sort of thing, you can find that at either our YouTube or Facebook sites in the video section, and it gives a great overview in there that we went over before all of this started. So we are in chapter 11. We're finishing chapter 11. Now chapter 11 and chapter 12 is a divisional type chapter. Chapter 12 starts a new section where God is not rehashing history so much with them, with his people, with the Israelites. And he just basically, in chapter 12, starts getting into what they need to do. He's been talking about what they need to do, but he's been adding history and basically framing why he needs to speak with them and treat them the way that he has been treating them. And when you look at it, he's treating them like they're children, and there's good reason for that. You find that in chapter 9 especially. So let's finish chapter 11. Now, we will finish, if you have the booklet, it's questions 5 and 6. And that's 11. We're going to read all the way from 18 to 32. We're just going to read all 14 of those. There's a couple of questions that we covered, and then we'll get into chapter 12. So there's some repetition here, as is usual for this book, where he says, "And you shall lay these words up in your hearts and in your souls, and shall bind them for a sign on your hand. And they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. And you shall teach them to your sons by speaking of them as you sit in your house, and as you walk in the way, and as you shall lie down, and as you rise up. And you shall write them on the side posts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied in the land which Jehovah has sworn to your fathers, to give to them as the days of heavens over the earth. For if keeping, you will keep this command which I am commanding you to do it, to love Jehovah your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave to him, then Jehovah shall dispossess these nations from before you, and you shall possess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place where the sole of your foot treads shall be yours, from the sea, from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river, the Euphrates rivers, even to the furthest sea shall be your border. No man shall stand before you. Jehovah your God shall put your dread and your fear on the face of all the land on which you tread, as he has spoken to you. Behold, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. A blessing if you hear the commandments of Jehovah your God, which I command you today, and a curse if you will not hear the commandments of Jehovah your God, but will turn aside out of the way which I command you today, to go after other gods which you have not known. And it shall be when Jehovah your God shall bring you into the land to which you go to possess it, that you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal," and those things happen later in the book. "And they are not beyond the Jordan, and are they not beyond the Jordan, behind the way of the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites that live in the Arabah, opposite to Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh. For you are to cross over the Jordan, to go in to possess the land which Jehovah your God is giving you, and you shall possess it and live in it, and take heed to do all the statutes and the judgments which I am giving you today. So it's very similar to a lot of the language we've already heard, and that closes out that section where God is talking to them and saying, I'm attaching the land to this covenant. And you need to obey me, and there's all sorts of other things he's telling them that you need to love me with all your heart, mind, and soul. And he also says, again, don't forget my words, repeat them as often as you can. And let's remember, they don't have the written word. So it is an oral tradition for them at this point. Of course, Moses, by the time he dies, does have it all written down, but it's not like they had books like we had today. So oral tradition was still very important in that day. So the questions that Brent had for the class was, what are the people to do with God's words? And what choice was set before the people? Now I'm going to go over my answers first. Then I'm going to go over what everybody else said when I'm done with my stuff. And there was a lot of great discussion in this class. I just said this is a restatement of the effort needed for mankind to keep God at the forefront of their lives. Man was to keep the word, which means to protect it. They were to build a hedge around it. It was to be at the forefront of everything they thought and did. The overriding question is, why would God feel the need to repeat this? Perhaps what we found in chapters 8 and 9 reveals why. They were stiff-necked, and they had a tendency to become arrogant against God. And even though they had been blessed by him, they still became arrogant toward him. And I don't know that they completely understood this about themselves because they continued to do it. But that is the reason and or reasons why I think, anyway, God felt the need to be repetitive toward them like they were children. It was a great treasure that he and his word were to be protected by them by the telling and retelling about him and his word. And more important, they were to be living examples of God's word. And the word embodies his character and should have embodied their characters as well. So what was being set before them is a blessing and a curse. And God just kind of glosses over it very quickly at this point, but later on he gets more into it, and many chapters later. This accentuates the reasoning behind the repetitive nature of these statements by Moses. This dispensation is legal speak, in the sense that there will be no misunderstanding of God's requirements. There will be no excuse. It alleviates any avenue of argument against the covenant and bad behavior. So it's going to be either a blessing for you or it's going to be a curse. And that ends chapter 11. Okay, so in chapter 12, we really didn't get very far. Let's see, we got through verse 14. I guess we did get pretty far. We got through verse 14 about halfway. And we're going to get right into that. And so God changes the tone as he's delivering his word through Moses. He changes the tone of the things that he's going to be saying. He's still basically saying the same thing. However, he's going to be iterating specific laws and specific things that they have to do. This isn't just about, going into the land and conquering people and don't forget me and you need to love me with all your heart. This is going to be about how they live their everyday lives. And so it's interesting to see the first order of business is for them to go into the land and dispossess the peoples there. But specifically, once they do that, wipe out idolatry, which means to remove its memory from the land. and then establish the place where God is to be worshipped. And we had quite a bit to say about that. There was quite a few comments about all of this. And it's interesting to see the kind of things that God is commanding them to do in regard to the worship. So he says in chapter 12, verse 1, "These are the statutes and the ordinances which you shall take heed to do in the land which Jehovah the God of your fathers has given you to possess it, all the days that you live on the earth. Destroying, you shall destroy all the places where the nations which you are dispossessing serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every leafy tree. And you shall break down their altars and shatter their standing pillars, and you shall burn down their Asherahs with fire, and you shall cut down their carved images and their gods and destroy their names out of that place." He's saying that literally means you remove the very memory of what was going on there. You shall not do so to Jehovah your God. In other words, you shall not remove the name of God. You shall not forget God. But you shall seek to the place which Jehovah your God shall choose. Jehovah God shall choose out of all your tribes for you to seek his dwelling place, to put his name there. So God's going to establish where they're going to worship. And you shall go there, and you shall bring your burnt offerings there, and your sacrifices, and your tithes, and the heave offering of your hand, and your vows, and your freewill offering, and your firstlings of your herds and your flock. And you shall eat there before Jehovah your God, and shall rejoice. This is a command. You shall rejoice in all that you put your hand to do, you and your households, with which Jehovah your God has blessed you. You shall do according to all that we are doing here today. You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, each doing all that is right in his own eyes. Interesting. For you have not come to the rest and to the inheritance which Jehovah your God is giving you. And you shall cross over the Jordan, and you shall live in the land which Jehovah your God is causing you to inherit. And you shall give, and he shall give you rest from all your enemies all around, and you shall live securely, and it shall be the place which Jehovah your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. There you shall bring all that I am commanding you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices and tithes and heave offerings of your hand, and all your choice free will offerings, which you vow to Jehovah. And you shall rejoice before Jehovah your God. Wow, that's an interesting command, yeah? And you and your sons and your daughters and your male slaves and your female slaves and the Levite within your gates, because he has no portion or inheritance with you. Take heed to yourself that you not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place which Jehovah shall choose in one of your tribes, there you shall burn your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command. And we understand later, those a couple of places, Shiloh, and then ultimately Jerusalem is where the temple is, and that's much, much later. So there's going to be some history. But God's telling them now, when I tell you there's going to be a specific place, that's where you're going to worship me. And you're going to rejoice when you do it. Okay, that's an interesting thing. He says, don't do what you're doing now, which is everybody just does whatever they want, which is interesting. And I tried to note that in the beginning of the study, because they had the tabernacle and they were told what to do at the tabernacle, but for some reason they were doing whatever each guy felt what they wanted to do. So that brought up some very interesting discussions and very interesting questions and statements from some of the other Bible students in the class. So what were they to do when they come into the land? Well, the first order is to completely demolish and remove the places of idol worship and their implements. The second order is to go to the place that God establishes and set up a place of worship for Jehovah. That's it. That's pretty simple. It sounds simple. It's, obviously it was going to be an arduous thing for them to have to go into, they have things to do. They have to work. There will be an approved place of worship by Jehovah God. Note the foreshadowing of eating before God. And that was my note, the foreshadowing of eating before God, much like the communion that we do at the Churches of Christ every week, where we come together as Christians and we each examine ourselves individually, but we're all there together, remembering our place before God and humbly coming before Him as we partake of the Lord's Supper. Communion, yes, it's a structure for the Christian. When people come together in the name of God, it establishes a sense of belonging, in a physical sense, and it is something of a spiritual nature, much like obedience, the physical manifestation of a spiritual foundation. That's what we find today, and this is what God was trying to establish for them back then as well. Much the same thing, where they're coming together as a church. I mean, they were a nation. This is a nation church, right? All one church, all one nation coming together. Okay, what can in this part of the text, what could their worship be, and what could it not be? And so I just said, you shall not do according to all that they were doing that day, which brings up the question for me, what were they doing? Because they had the tabernacle, and they must have been doing something else. And I'm surprised that we don't hear a lot about it. But so God is telling them, you need to be more unified. You're not just going off on your own and doing your own thing. I'm going to tell you what to do, and then you do it. The big question is, what were they doing? They were directed only to sacrifice in the place approved by God, and they are to rejoice before Jehovah. How can we fulfill the requirement to rejoice? I asked that question, and it brought up a lot of good insight. If you're depressed, how do you rejoice before God? And I'm speaking from personal experience. There are times when you can be overtly depressed, chemically depressed, terribly depressed. So how do you find joy in God? How does the Christian find joy when there's so much craziness going on in the world, right? Isn't that what the non-believers say? How can you love a God who sees all these things but doesn't do anything about it? Which is a whole other thing that most people say when they don't understand God at all. They are directed to only sacrifice to the place approved by Jehovah. And how can Jehovah command this love and joy from a human perspective? This may appear arrogant, that God says you need to love me with all your heart, mind, and soul. You need to rejoice before me. But understanding the goodness of God is the key to understanding His love and concern and care for His people. And as humans, we can quickly forget these sort of truths. Okay, so what were some of the comments that everybody else had? Well, I wrote them down. I re-listened to the comments and wrote them down again. And I'm just going to go over them briefly, and then we'll be done. Okay, so God establishes worship is something that somebody said. And remove idolatry and establish this place to worship. And much like today, we remove sin from our lives. We remove the idols from our lives. God is to be at the forefront of our lives, not our jobs, not our country, not our president, or our wives, or husbands, or children. God needs to be first in our lives. Otherwise, you put something before God, that becomes an idol. Remove idolatry. This establishes the concept of many souls gathering. This was something that somebody brought up. It's not a worship that we do by ourselves, or we say, oh, I don't need to go to church. I don't need a church. I just, I'm going to deal with God, just me and Him, and I don't need to belong to a church. Well, if you read anything in the New Testament, Okay, no, it doesn't say anything like that. You need to go to the New Testament. If you hear somebody say that, just advise them to go to the New Testament to find out what God wants, or just teach them if you can. It just absolutely, this just shows that God never intended for us to be a bunch of individuals without congregating. Yes, individuals, we are saved individually by the things that we do, and but more specifically, those things that we do manifested because of our faith and love in God. But we are to come together, and this is something shown all the way back then. This was a foreshadow of the church. Cleaning out of the idols was to start fresh as a God-built culture, much like we see cultures like maybe even our own nation, if you will, where a lot of us older people remember that God was center of the culture, and we respected one another, and we didn't see a lot of people cursing, and we didn't see a lot of people degrading God. That was just something you didn't do because you had respect for God. And we've seen that decline just within our own lifetimes. As much as we try to teach and as much as we try to tell people about God, we see this degradation going on. These things can go away very quickly. There are to be no other influences on this. Also, speaking of joy, we should be happy to worship and serve before God. It's not about being served, but it's about serving. And this is something these are other statements made by other members in the study. It's not about us. It's about serving. It's about serving one another, and it's about serving God. And so it was not to be whatever they wanted. It needed to be what God directs. It needed to be taught to the following generations, children and grandchildren. And if God says to conquer something, to be his people, then we need to conquer it. In this case, it was other peoples and idolatry. In our lives, it's sin and idolatry still. Idolatry takes on all sorts of forms, even today. We and they were to commit to God and then to each other. And in that sense, they would find strength. And they would be answering to God and to one another. And that's what we find in churches. Not in the judgmental way, but in the sense that we as Christians just look to clean up our act. We look to be honest people. We look to be trustworthy. We help each other. We love one another. And we're watching out for one another. And joy is not, this was something else somebody else brought up. Joy is not contingent on circumstance. It's found in our faith in God. And happiness is this externally affected condition, but joy is something that rises up internally from within us. And it comes from our soul and spirit. It comes from within us because of our faith in God. The person put it this way: we wake up knowing that we have God in our lives. And so because of that, we have joy. And that can only be found, through committing our lives to God. This is where we find our hope. Our view of worldly problems is not handled like the world. If we have God and we consider the Christ who hung on the cross and was all alone and suffered, and yet considered it all joy for the glory that was set before him. The Christian view looks beyond the temporary circumstance in that same sense, the same way that Jesus the Christ did. That's how we continue in joy, even though circumstances in our lives aren't always optimal. And sometimes we are terribly depressed. But with God, we know we'll come out of that. Ultimately, we are God's children. And in the eternal sense. And this is where Christians kind of leave so many people behind. We think eternally, not just externally or even internally. We think eternally. Another note was about Philippians that talks about rejoicing in the Lord. This is where we find our joy. And as a church family, it far exceeds anything we can do on our own. In other words, when we come together, we have so much more joy when we do that, so much more than if we were just, I'm going to stay at home and read my Bible and God will be happy with me. Meditating on the Word of God will surpass anything in this world was another statement. We seek to be strong individually, and when we come together, our joy becomes manifold in size and meaning. And I'm paraphrasing everything for time. So church is a place where we help one another, and this is what they were to be doing as well. That's the reason why we're reading through this. There is a positive energy in a loving church, and this is something that one of the other participants said. You know, she said, you know, I go to church and I just see love there. We're just so happy to see one another. You know, it's difficult to sit down and be still in the beginning, you know, before services because we're just excited to be there with each other. And that's what a positive energy church does. You're there for each other. You don't go there for you. You go there to be with other people and serve them. We are to give everything to Jesus. The joy, and Psalm 1, the joy of the world is found in meditating in His Word. And we kind of left it off there. There was a lot more there, and I'm really paraphrasing and making this as short as possible, just as a review of the class. So if you missed the class, that's okay. Now you know what we talked about, and you can come in right on in this next one, and we'll be continuing in chapter 12. And we'll be moving forward from there. So there, the class is yours. Thank you for listening. We just hope and pray always that God would continue to bless us and continue to bless you as well. If you have any questions about the Bible or about God in general and what His plan is for you, which is the basic plan that He has for everybody, there's just a little nuance for every individual. You can ask us. I'll put the website addresses where you can locate us in the description at the end of this video. Thank you, and may God bless you.